Hi everyone, welcome to my talk. This talk is titled Lonely Lon 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 Lon, or in English, Anti-Realism, Subjectivism, and Truth in Toki Pona. Before I start, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Haru, or in Toki Pona, you could say Soweli Suli Alu Pikolete. I'm a Singaporean math and philosophy student, and my main interests are in logic, epistemology, which is the study of knowledge, philosophy of language, and logical metaphysics, which is the thinking about realism of logic and truth, and ontology of objects, which is basically trying to think about categories of objects and what it means to exist. In case you don't know what a Soweli Suli Picolete is, I've included a helpful picture on the right. If you wish to contact me, you may do so via these avenues. I live in Singapore, so my time zone is UTC +8. So this presentation will be mostly in English with definitions in Toki Pona. It's not definitive, so I welcome disagreements, and it's not really meant to be that kind of informational talk where I'm presenting objective facts that disagreements are going to be wrong, and it's meant to be thought-provoking and not a comprehensive presentation either. So I'll be asking more questions than I might be answering in this talk, and I hope that's okay with you. There's much else to be explored than what I'm introducing here because I'm merely broaching the tip of the iceberg, and I'm giving more emphasis on things to think about after this talk that you should feel encouraged to discuss. But just to keep things related, since this is Sunopi Toki Pona after all, I will be giving them from a Toki Ponan angle. So this presentation will be split into roughly 5 parts. After the introduction, which is this, I'll be talking about realism in Toki Pona, which is about how language has meaning, or if there's a one true meaning. After that, I'll be talking about truth. What is truth, and how is truth portrayed in language? After that, I'll be talking about knowledge. Mainly, how does how we know affect communication? And then some concluding thoughts. So first, about realism. Realism is about objectivity. Realism holds that there's objectively true facts, moral actions, correct interpretations. Essentially, it holds that there's objectively true features, or there's features that exist in a world, objectively your interpretation and your conception and everything. So if you hold realism, you hold that. Anti-realism is the opposite of that, and it rejects that notion of objectivity. So there's a bunch of different ways you can think about it, and a bunch of different ways it has been argued. So for example, you might say, like what I said, objectivity cannot exist. You might say that features only exist when recognized, which is sometimes you might see that in some arguments against realism of metaphysics. And you might see some argumentations that features are not inherent but subjective. So the features are not inherent to the objects in question themselves, but you give them the features, for example. Moving on pretty swiftly, we come to the topic of syntactic realism. So is syntax objective? Do sentences have objectively correct structure? So if you study syntax and grammar, you know there's ways to analyze the structure of a sentence, and it might be presented that there's one true way. There's a correct grammar and correct structure. So the question is whether if it's objectively so, whether it's inherent to the sentence and inherent to language itself. So some questions you might ask is, how do we explain grammatical tendencies? Because if you subscribe to generative linguistics, you might think that it has to do with linguistic conception, that's just the way the mind thinks, and inherent to language, there's going to be patterns, like something like that. Or you might ask, how do people parse sentences differently? Or how do people construct sentences differently? Is it even different at all? who's right and who's wrong if it is different? So those are some questions you might ask about syntax. So some preliminaries before I go into this topic deeper. Like I mentioned, it deals with grammar. So you might ask, what is grammar? Grammar essentially answers the following questions, like how is language structured? What are the rules, if any, that structure language, and how do speakers use and think about language? And the way I like to put across the concept of grammar is that you can say a bunch of words and a bunch of sounds, but what really distinguishes those random sequences of words and sounds or letters, if you're writing them, from actual recognizably valid sentences that you recognize as sentences that are valid in that language. So that concept of what makes it different from just random sequences of words or sounds and actual valid sentences, that is grammar. This is what I like to say. So it can be analyzed in several ways. Don't be intimidated by the graphics on the right. So for example, you might analyze it in terms of constituency, which is the idea that you can have parts that comprise a whole, and you're trying to talk about which parts comprise what other parts. So that's the image on the left. You might know that as phrase constituency analysis, or if you a specific version more familiar to the linguist might be X bar. Or you might do dependency, which is where you're trying to talk about which parts of the sentence depend on which other parts and the relation of that dependency. So like in the right example, you can see there's the dependency of the verb sees, and that John is the subject of sees and Mary is the direct object of the verb sees. So that's also another way you can analyze it. Or you can even do a bunch of other ways like function or cognition, or like the roles they play thematically, etc., etc. But the main idea is that you split the sentences into parts, and you determine how parts relate to one another. You identify how relations affect structure, and that essentially forms the analysis of the grammar, because you can develop rules based on that, and then you have a hopefully descriptive grammar for your language. Then you have parsing, which is the process of analyzing sentences. Grammar informs how sentences break into parts, like I mentioned, and it allows you to understand the sentences, because if you know how it breaks into parts and you know the relationship between parts, then you're mentally able to sort of do that process of taking a sentence and splitting it into the parts yourself by applying the grammatical rules, and you sort of form an understanding for yourself based on the stipulated ways they interact with each other. So you can sort of construct your own understanding of it based on the grammar. So one thing that you might want to consider during parsing is called scope. What is scope? So if you look on the right, I have included some examples for you. So like for example, Rojas and me saw a duck. The scope of the conjunction and here is Rojas and me. So the second example, he is not a good person. The scope of not is not a good person. So the negation is on a good person, basically. Or the last example, I've not seen a red duck before. The scope of red here is duck, because that is what is modifying. So the parts related to a part are its scope, and it includes itself. And it's determined by grammar. So the scope of an operator is defined by the grammatical rules. So you might ask yourself, is there any ambiguity in this? Because I'm making it sound like there's definite rules and there's one way to do things. So consider the sentence. Flying planes can be dangerous. How do you parse this? And are there other ways to parse this? One way you might parse this is you might think of it as flying planes can be dangerous. So you're thinking of flying as an adjective for planes, and you're thinking about the planes that are flying, and you're saying those are dangerous. Alternatively, you might be thinking about flying planes as in the action of flying a plane can be dangerous. So there are two ways to think about this syntactically. Then there's also scope, and the idea that scope can be ambiguous as well. Most people consider this also syntactic ambiguity. So for example, all that glitters is not gold. So you might know this guy called Bertrand Russell, and he commented that this proverb is ambiguous. How is it ambiguous? Well, for one, you might think that he's saying all that glitters is not gold refers to the entire sentence, all that glitters is not gold. So you're negating the sentence, all that glitters is gold. Alternatively, you might be saying that all that glitters is not gold means not gold, as in everything that glitters is something other than gold, like maybe it's silver or something, which you might think is definitely not what the proverb is saying. It's probably saying the first one, but keep that idea in the back of your head. So moving on, there's this concept called grammar shift. So I would like to invite you to look at these sentences here. I saw the person who he was talking with, or I saw the person with whom he was talking. If I was a billionaire, I would buy my cat a house. Or, if I were a billionaire, I would buy my cat a house. Or lastly, he couldn't lift up the weight. Or, he couldn't lift the weight up. Which ones feel natural to say to you? Is there one that you can see yourself saying? Is there one that feels weird to you? The idea is that grammar has changed over time. You might recognize the highlighted words as being part of some rules you were taught in school, like that actually you're not supposed to split phrasal verbs. You're not supposed to split the infinitive. You can't. You're not supposed to hang prepositions or something. But the fact of the matter is that even if those features were true at some point of time, they might not be true right now, because people's usage of language has just changed over time. So you might feel a bit rigid if you're trying to force yourself to speak correctly like your school has taught you. So let's think about this in terms of toki pona. Which ones are right? Is there a more correct reading? Like I mentioned for the proverb example, it seems clear that it's trying to negate all that glitters is gold. So it seems clear that that's the correct reading. But is that really so? And is there a more correct construction? Like you might say, if I follow the rules that my school taught me, that construction is correct and everything else is wrong. So keeping those in mind, you might hear people say toki pona is prone to syntactic ambiguity. So like for example on the right, you have a sentence that can be interpreted two ways. Yen lialasa e olin lon tomo. You might interpret that as one singular object of the alasa. So you might think of it as looking for true familial love. Alternatively, the same sentence, you could think of it as one a phrase and one lon phrase. So you might be thinking it actually means a person looks for true love at home, so that lon tomo is not actually modifying the olin. So that's one example. The reason why people say this is because phrases can often take on many roles, and the minimalist design makes it like that, because there's little words and like words have to double over different grammatical features. They can represent different roles and functions. Like in the example, the ambiguity here comes from the fact that lon can actually refer to both the content word, like real or true, which I'll talk about later actually, or it can refer to the preposition where it's like something like at or on, depending on the context. So because roles can change depending on passing, and the fact that phrase boundaries can be less clear, like whether everything is one direct object or whether it's two different phrases, it might present itself as syntactic ambiguity. But is this really bad? That's the next question. Like people present that as a criticism to toki pona. So if you subscribe to syntactic realism, it suggests as a correct way to parse and construct. Is it the speaker's job to form sentences without syntactic ambiguities? So like, is it my job to pick the least ambiguous way to put the words together? Or is it the listener's job to resolve ambiguities? Like, can the speaker just say anything they want, and it's my job as a listener to try and piece together what they are saying through the ambiguities that has been formed in their sentence? So whose fault is it? Is that a fault? Sounds pretty bad to say that it's someone's fault when there's ambiguity in the language. Is it even possible to do this anyway? Can I know that it's possible for me to form sentences or to resolve ambiguities myself? This is a pretty strict way of thinking, so I'll talk about it more later about this kind of thinking, and whether maybe it's necessary that instead of thinking about it like this, that we change the way that we think about language and we think about syntax. If it's harder to avoid syntactic ambiguities, and if one must decide between more syntactic ambiguities, like if the language is more minimalist and there's more syntactic ambiguities, is that bad? It's a good language one without syntactic ambiguities. Like there's a lot of log langs that present themselves as having a one-to-one translation between the language itself and the logical form, which is it's another way to analyze the grammar. So they're positing that it's there's no ambiguities in that manner, there's no syntactic ambiguities. Is that a good language because of that feature? So I want you to consider this. Natural languages are often rife with syntactic ambiguities. Like in the English examples I presented, those had ambiguities, and you see ambiguities yourself all the time. So why is that so? There's this thing called the principle of least effort, which I'm going to abbreviate as PLE. Speakers are lazy. They don't want to work harder than necessary. They don't want to put in more effort to say more words, to think about more grammar. So because people are lazy, use evolves to require less effort for understanding. So as long as I understand you, if I can use less words to get away with it, I will, because I'm lazy. And syntactic ambiguities often survive or often increase because of this principle. So I have cited a few stuff for you to look at if you're not convinced about this. Like I mentioned, this operates on the fact that I'm communicating just fine with you. We both understand each other, so the fact that I'm being more lazy doesn't really matter. Are we justified in calling languages bad in spite of this, even though we're still understanding each other? Or like I mentioned, should we change how we think about language? Which I'll talk more about later. And lastly, can the same be said for toki pona, a constructed language? Because when you come to think about a constructed language, the fact that it's constructed makes it feel like maybe you can't argue this way because it is constructed. But people always say that toki pona is a living language. But is that really so? I don't want to take that for granted. I don't want to assume that. So the questions I have to ask: do we follow the syntax patterns just because Sonia Lang said that out of convention? Or is it because it is sufficient to understand each other? Have we really evolved our syntax beyond just an arbitrary rule set? Or are our syntax rules still just a arbitrary palimpsest of what she had to say? So regarding grammar shift and evolution of use, can there really be a realist grammar amidst grammar shift? Because if you remember, realist means that there's objective truth, that there's, regardless of what you think, regardless of what you conceive about it, there is one objective truth. But I just said that grammar can change, that I can be lazy and then just decide I want to say things differently. So some people have said maybe it's not that the grammar specifically, that specific grammar in that snapshot of time is the realist grammar. Maybe what instead is realist is the analysis and the cross-linguistics patterns, like the way that I can analyze the grammar, the function that phrases have, if I choose to analyze it as phrases, that is real. The specific instances of it is not real, but that is real. So that's one response. And like I mentioned, the idea behind generative linguistics is that they can explain that through some thoughts about linguistics, and that the way human people think about language just makes that sort of innate to language, that people structure it that way across languages. But to what extent do constructed languages conform to this realism? Because if you're thinking about languages in terms of their cross-linguistics patterns as they've evolved over time. Well, constructed languages are constructed. So can I argue the same thing about constructed languages? And more importantly, do they even have language grammar shift? Because they're constructed, like I said. And grammar shift happens over time when people get lazy and change the grammar. Does that happen for constructed languages? Or does being constructed necessitate syntactic realism because the person who constructed it can define a set of rules and just say that is the correct rule? So that's what I'm going to say about syntax for now. And now we move on to semantic realism. Is semantics objective? Well, wait, what is semantics? Well, semantics is sort of like a fancy word for saying meaning. So the way I describe it is that syntax tells you whether a sentence is valid, but it does not tell you what the sentence actually says. So that's where semantics comes in, where I have like a valid sentence and the way I put it together is true grammar and stuff, but the meaning and the understanding I get from that sentence, that's semantics. So the questions I have for this are, do we give meaning to language? Or is the meaning inherent to language? And lastly, what is the nature of interpretation? So as always, I'm going to present both realist and anti-realist meaning. So I'm going to start with realist theories of meaning. So it claims that language has objective meaning because, well, it's realist. And there's a bunch of different ways you can argue this. I'm going to present a few here. So the first one is called truth conditional semantics, or specifically on declarative statements, because it gets a bit hard to argue for other stuff like modality, like would, could, should, and a bunch of other stuff. So for now, I'll just limit it to just declarative statements. So it says that meaning is whether or not a sentence is true. And it's inherent because the sentence being true is just based on the state of the world. Like, for example, if I say, snow is white, it's true. It just is because snow is white. So I can argue that it's inherent in that way. But how do we know what is true or not? Because it becomes a sort of argument where if I'm saying a sentence meaning is based on whether it's true or not, well, I might not necessarily know whether it's true or not. And some things I might not be able to know. Like if I say a sentence about something that I cannot know is true, what is its inherent meaning? Because I'll never be able to know. Another one is called expression meaning. Basically, the idea is that the meaning is based on consensus. X means Y if and only if I write IFF, that's what it means. If and only if people generally use X that way. It sounds a bit vague, but I'll explain more later. So the question I have is, what about sentences nobody has used before? Because I'm saying meaning is based on consensus and people generally use it that way. Well, what if no one has used it? What is its meaning? And what is your criteria for generally used? It's a bit vague. So like I mentioned, it's also vague that use X that way is phrased. It was phrased intentionally vaguely by Greece. So he has this thing called speaker meaning, and he defines expression meaning using this speaker meaning, which is the use X that way part. So meaning is based on intention. So when I say X, I have the intention that you, the audience, understand it to mean this specific thing. So this intention, my intention, that is the meaning of this. So when I say use X that way, it means I say X and expect you to understand it to mean Y. But the specific way you understand it to mean that specific thing is because you know my intention. Like if I say grass is green, you understand what I mean because you understand what I want you to know when I say grass is green. But that sounds a bit circular, doesn't it? Because you can argue that this is restricted by convention itself. Like, I wouldn't say grass is green and then expect you to know that I mean grass is red actually. Because by convention, when I say grass is green, doesn't that mean that I mean grass is green? Because that's what people usually mean. So I wouldn't say grass is green to expect you to understand that grass is red, for example. So it feels a bit circular because he's defining expression meaning using speaker meaning, but now it seems like speaker meaning is defined on expression meaning. So that's where I'll end the realist theories of meaning for now. And now I'll come to anti-realist theories of meaning. So they claim that language does not have objective meaning. That's why it's called anti-realist. So it varies a bit. Some people say that the meaning varies with context. Some people say it varies with interpretation. Some people say it varies with thoughts, etc., etc. But I'll specifically focus on what's called a subjectivist take on those latter two ones. Subjectivist, I'll define that. So what is subjectivism? Well, at least applied to language, because it can mean a bunch of things, like for metaphysics and other stuff. But specifically for language, what does it mean? So for one, it's anti-realist, so there's no objective meaning. But I'm also saying that meaning is what we perceive it to be. So essentially I'm saying that the only meaning I know of a word is the meaning that I think it means. I'm also saying that other people can have their own meaning of words because it's how they perceive it to be, but I can't know of their meaning because I can't know how they perceive it. So to further explicate this idea, there's this guy called Locke, and he said this really long time ago, but he has this idea called, idea, but to differentiate the word idea from just regular usage, I'll capitalize it for you. So he says language is to communicate thought. It's pretty unoffensive. Thoughts are made of ideas, his special ideas, and that ideas are a subjective representation of things. So, they're my ideas, and like I might have an idea of plants, I might have an idea of snow, and they are my representation. And like mentioned, someone's ideas cannot be perceived by another. So the way I represent snow, well, you'll never know how I think of it because you're not me. And he says that words are arbitrary signs for ideas. So there's no inherent meaning, no inherent signage. They're completely arbitrary. I've picked the word to say the thing just because I feel like it's appropriate. And as mentioned, words have no intrinsic meaning. So you can see in the graph there on the right that the ideas are non-transferable. I cannot give you my idea, but I can arbitrarily say that this word signifies my idea. And I say the word, then you hear the word, and then you think it signifies this other idea. If you're currently thinking, well, the ideas are different, aren't they? Hold that thought, because I'll come back to it. So, are there issues with treating words as atomic, like he does? And how does communication work then? So if you remember what I said just now, that the graphic seems like idea A is not the same as idea B, so how does communication happen? So Wittgenstein has argued that genuine communication requires knowledge of what the speaker means. So if you don't know what I mean, then you have not genuinely communicated. And if my idea B cannot be known by you, how is that possible? And because I've said that the signification of words are arbitrary, well, how do you know how I've chosen the words if you don't know the arbitrary way that I've chosen to pick my words to sign the ideas? So here's where this other concept comes in, Quine and Davidson's radical interpretation. So if you're exposed to a foreign use of language, so you don't understand it immediately, you can still understand it eventually after observing how people use it. So Quine illustrates this by this example language where there's this word called gavagai and it means rabbit, or there is a rabbit or something. You don't actually know, but he asks you to imagine that you're a field linguist and someone has said gavagai and pointed at a rabbit. So because of that, you can guess that gavagai probably means something to do with rabbit. Maybe it means rabbit, there is a rabbit over here or something. And over time, as people keep on using that language, you keep on hearing gavagai, and you keep on seeing rabbits, you're more and more confident that it really does mean rabbit or something. So eventually you have a collection of your guesses of the language, and they're refined over time because you can verify them, tweak them, etc. And Quine argues that all understanding is like this. So it's not just for his example language, like his fiction language, where you're in a foreign land and you're a field linguist. It's not just like that. He says that all languages is like that. How you acquire your first language, how you acquire your next, they're all like that. But of course, there are some underlying assumptions that is important to recognize. So for one, you assume that when I say something, I don't say it meaninglessly. Like in the example he gave, when he says gavagai, you assume the person who is pointing at the rabbit is actually meaning to say something about the rabbit when he says gavagai. Or more broadly speaking, you assume he had a purpose to say the word gavagai. And you also assume that what I say is reasonable for the circumstances. Like for example, if someone is learning English and is trying to figure out English through this radical interpretation way, I can't like troll the person and point at the grass and say that's a cloud, because that's not reasonable for the circumstances. That's not a cloud. I should say it's grass. So the idea that makes this work is called the principle of charity, well, for language at least, because it means a bunch of other things. But charitable interpretation is where I presume that what you are saying is said purposefully and it's reasonable. I don't know, but I just assume. But is this really reasonable? Is this assumption reasonable? It's for you to think about. I argue that toki pona begins with the assumption that language has no objective meaning. So it's inherently anti-realist. It's pretty funny, but that's what I argue. And if you attempt to fix meaning of finitely many words, like toki pona, which has a bunch, I argue that it's unfeasible. And then next, I argue that toki pona is facilitated by radical interpretation. So its function as a language depends on the principle of charity, because as I've defined it, that's what radical interpretation depends on. So by extension, toki pona depends on the principle of charity. And lastly, that the lack of intention of relevance, like non sequitur, is incoherent in toki pona. So I'll go through them claim by claim. So for the first one, I claim that toki pona is anti-realist by nature. So toki pona has established that words are signed for subjective semantic spaces. So like if you've seen nimi.li, there's Lipamanga's semantic spaces over there. So they function, I claim, as collections of ideas that words can signify. So your ideas that you determine, like for example, soweli is suitable to signify, that's your semantic space for soweli. And like ideas, they cannot be perceived by other people. Like you'll never be able to actually see what I consider to be a soweli. And toki pona establishes that the usage of words is arbitrary. Like if you read pu, it says right there in the preface, this is the way I use toki pona. So Sonia has clarified that it's completely arbitrary. Next claim I have is that attempting to fix meaning of finitely many toki ponan words, in brackets because that's what's relevant, is unfeasible. I'm giving a bit of a reduced argument here because it gets a bit complicated if I don't. But first, you assume each word has fixed meaning, and then you assume each way words can be composed has fixed meaning. So you're also assuming things about syntax. So there are concepts no composition of words actually means. And here I'm going to define sentence to be composition of words. Like for example, if I have two words, if I have car and I have dog, there's going to be some concepts that no matter how I've defined the ways that you can compose car and dog, there's going to be concepts that they can't directly mean. Like I can't talk about a cloud. No matter how much I compose the words, I can't express it. So if I want to argue that this language is expressive, that it can say things, I must allow my speaker to use a sentence outside of his fixed meaning. So like in that example, if I want to say cloud, I cannot fix the meaning of car to just mean cars. I cannot fix the meaning that way. I have to allow maybe my speaker thinks actually a cloud moves and it kind of looks like a car. So I'm going to say car to mean cloud. I must allow that. Otherwise, there's a limitation in expressivity. And this becomes more evident the less words and ways of composition there are. So in the super extreme example I gave, there's two words. So it's so evident. So to convince you of this, because you might not be convinced, consider new learners that are referring to dictionaries like nimi.ly and Linggu. They often fail to understand sentences because they're coming from the idea that the words have fixed definitions. Like they think, for example, that pona must mean give. So if you use it to mean something like to give light, for example, they get a bit confused because their understanding is that it must mean give, like I'm giving a physical object. So how can you be talking about emitting light using that word? So they're confused. And as a corollary for that, toki pona assumes the language has no objective meaning, like I mentioned, because it follows that toki pona must reject the assumptions. For a less minimalist language like English, for example, the effect can be negligible, so you might not actually need to reject assumptions in practice, because like for example in English you have like hundreds of thousands of words, so the idea that concepts cannot be expressed with fixed meaning is a bit less strong. So I'm not going to argue about that. I'm going to argue for specifically minimalist languages. And to be functional, like I mentioned, to be expressive, toki pona must allow novel use of language. And novel use, I'm saying here, is use of language that is not fixed. It's not the defined use or not the traditional use. For example, I'm gonna put that in air quotes that you can't see, because I'm not holding that that's the correct use. Speakers are allowed to decide that a sentence can express new concepts, like I mentioned, so I'm not going to fix them to concepts. And listeners are allowed to interpret new meanings for sentences, because they have to if I'm going to allow speakers to do this. So my next claim is that toki pona is facilitated by radical interpretation. How do speakers know what sentences mean without objective definitions? Like I mentioned, the previous objection. So speakers are exposed to and radically interpret these novel uses of sentences. So like for example, if I keep on saying the word for car and I keep on talking about clouds that way, like in my previous example, well, eventually people are going to realize that I'm saying car to mean cloud. And they can verify this over time, like I mentioned, the more I keep on doing it. Like I can keep on saying the word for car to refer to both cars and clouds, and then eventually they'll verify that, hey, actually, they are using it to refer to both cars and clouds. And then those people can now say the word for car and also talk about clouds because they are using their radical interpretation to produce sentences. And actually, toki pona's communicative ability depends on the viability of radical interpretation. If you can't radically interpret, toki pona sort of fails, because without radical interpretation, you would have trouble trying to figure out what people are trying to say because of the novel uses, because people have to use it in new contexts, and if you can't radically interpret it, then you can't understand it. So because I've mentioned that toki pona depends on radical interpretation, and I've also defined that the principle of charity is what enables it, then as a corollary, toki pona's function depends on the principle of charity. Novel uses of sentences are charitably interpreted. The speaker does not immediately understand the usage, and they search for connections between the context and the usage. Like I mentioned, if I say the word for car, and I'm not pointing to a car, then the speaker assumes that I mean something by my usage of car, and they assume that when I say car, that it's situationally appropriate, even though there's no car right there. So they're looking for a connection, and they see I'm pointing to a cloud. So that's the connection they form in their mind, that the radical interpretation is that car, in this context, means cloud. And then if there's none, like if I'm just randomly saying the word for car, and I'm not doing anything, I don't mean anything by it, I just randomly said car. Well, there's no understanding gain because I've just randomly said the word car, and there's no connections that you can find. Or if there is, when I say car again, you're going to realize it was wrong because I didn't mean anything by it. So recall, the novel use of language must be allowed because that's what you need for it to be able to express in a minimalist language. So they must be able to be charitably interpreted. So it follows that a lack of intention of relevance is incoherent in toki pona. A sentence inappropriate for the context is said. Like in the example I gave, I said car, but I didn't mean anything by it. I just said car. Well, trivially, it's a novel use of language. I'm using car to mean something in an unfamiliar way because I don't mean anything at all, so it's unfamiliar by default. But it can't be charitably interpreted because if you're assuming that I mean something by it and I said, haha, I don't, well, it can't be charitably interpreted and therefore it cannot be understood because if you're trying to find the connections, you can't. But if you compare non sequitur in other languages, they can often still be understood. Like if I randomly decided to say in my talk, I think oranges are cool, even though it doesn't mean anything, and I didn't mean anything by that specific sentence, you can still understand that I mean that oranges are cool. So how is this relevant to language in general? Well, there's this concept that some of you might be familiar with that is called linguistic prescriptivism. So it's an establishment of rules of language and tries to establish a standard language, and oftentimes it would establish that other versions are non-standard. Like, unfortunately, if you have been paying attention, my accent sounds very heavily inflected. Well, that's because in school, I was taught that this is a correct accent to pronounce English. So this is the standard accent. Whoops. Is that realist? Well, because it sounds like they're trying to establish as an objective language here. So it sounds a bit realist. And how does this affect languages? And is this present in toki pona? So some examples, dictionaries, like in the 15th century, as Middle English was progressing to early modern English, there were a ton of dictionaries and they heavily influenced and sort of cemented word usages. But specifically, the way that it was used by the royalty and by the aristocrats. And then there's language regulators like l'Académie Française. And then there's style guides, like the thing I mentioned, the known conjugation at the start of sentences. Don't start your sentences with but and. And then lastly, language reform, like the transformation from 繁体字 to 简体字. Well, the English, it's called Chinese character simplification schemes. That's a language reform, for example. Well, if you recall the earlier objection to Locke's ideas, how does one know the signification of words if they are arbitrary? Prescriptivism aims to address this by establishing independent rules of language. So, in this case, the independent rules of language, they represent a linguistic community's rules. Like in the example, the dictionaries, they represent the rules of the royalty and the aristocrats. So it's important for sociolinguistics, which deals a bit of the politics of things, which linguistic community actually is being represented here. But that's a different talk, so I'm not going to go so deep into it, but it's important to recognize. Well, they say that meaning is whether one's rule following meets others' expectations. So if I say, like I mentioned, grass is green, it meets other people's expectations because they expect me to say grass is green and I've said it. And the expectation for the way you use the word grass, the way you use the word green, well, it checks out. So they're okay with it. So that's the meaning. It can be construed to be realist because it sort of sounds like I'm advocating for an objective truth and objective meaning based on other people's expectations. But should it really be? So let's broaden the definition a bit, because I'm going to use this definition later on. So let's say prescriptivism is preference for a linguistic community's rules over individuality. So it's important to note, as mentioned, the sociolinguistic precedence for what kind. So like if I'm forcing you to do it, or if I'm saying that you can't speak any other way, I'm outlawing it. So it's important to note there's different kinds. So I'm not going to trivialize it, but for me to talk about other things later on, I need to broaden the definition a bit. So the reason is because communities can hold expectations for rule following without formal establishment. So I'm going to drop the requirement. So one thing to note is that tokiponan resources do not present themselves as definitive. So nimili, pu, everything. Nothing says this is the correct tokipona. If you speak it any other way, you are wrong. Nothing says that. But does that mean that there's really no prescriptivism in tokipona communities? Like you keep on hearing people talking about the nasin pian mute or the nasin kulupu. Is that prescriptivism? Well, before I talk about that, let's think a bit about what this really entails. So if communication relies on my rule following, my use of language is merely by convention. I'm just following convention. Does this preclude self-expression? And to what extent does this apply to tokipona? On the other hand, is my individual use of language futile, like in the graphic that shows on the right, if the rules are determined by me and I'm expressing it because of my rules, the way I want to express it, and the community does not know about my rule because it's not the rule that they were expecting and it's not the rule that is representative of their rules, so they don't know about it necessarily. So when I say my thing and they check that expression for conformity against the rules, well, obviously they're not going to understand it. So is it futile? Because what I say will only ever mean what a community says. Am I never going to be able to be understood by others without rule following? Well, I argue for minimalist languages like tokipona, communication is unfeasible without individual expression. And in fact, I go even further to say the expectation is individual expression. So I'm saying community meaning is built on individual meaning. So because of that, I'm also arguing that the separation between the two is a little bit exaggerated. Like if you heard what I said just now, it sounds a bit exaggerated that individual expression means you're never going to be able to understand me. Also important to note, I have delimited it specifically to tokipona, minimalist languages like tokipona. It's important because it's harder to argue for a broader scope. But you can. I'm just not going to because it's hard. So proposition, the first one. Proposition, I'm going to introduce this one to help me produce my claims. So this proposition is that a community cannot cohesively expect what they do not know of, which sounds pretty reasonable, but I'm going to explain it. For a maximalist language, the solution provided by Kripke, which is the one just now, that meaning is based on whether my rule following fits expectations. That can be pretty satisfactory. Like I mentioned, for English, if you do that, there's not necessarily much trouble with that. Because the idea, like I mentioned, is that if you have more words and more constructions, those novel concepts are going to be much closer to familiar concepts. Like, it's going to be pretty hard to find a specific concept that is not close to an established English word or English phrase. So a community could reasonably come to hold similar expectations around it. But consider, for example, a language with only the words leopard and tiger. Could that community reliably expect how members would describe a cloud? I love talking about clouds. Hope you can forgive me for that. So the same cannot be said about minimalist languages, like I mentioned before, because I don't think you could reasonably expect people to pick a word in that case. Like, is a cloud more leopardy or tigery? I don't think a community could reliably pick one. So following from that, the first claim, communication is unfeasible without individual expression. So subclaim, well, novel usage is necessarily individual expression, because by a hypothesis, this usage is new to the language, which I'm going to be talking about as equivalent to the community, because I've defined speaking a language to be conforming to the community's expectations. That's the premise I'm working on. So commitment to this usage is ultimately a personal judgment of suitability, because if it's a novel usage, the community cannot evaluate this usage, as I've mentioned by the proposition. So it's my judgment, like in the example, it's my judgment whether cloud is more like a leopard or more like a tiger. That is my personal judgment. So I pick one, maybe leopard. So if you recall, minimalist languages must permit novel usage. So if by the subclaim that novel usage is necessarily individual expression, then minimalist languages must permit individual expression. Then the next claim, the expectation is individual expression. If novel usage must be in language and language is conformity to expectation, then by the proposition, expectation cannot be on usage, because then it just doesn't work. So you cannot expect expression, then what do? Because you still need to expect something if you're going to make it based on stuff like that. So let's expect the expression type instead. So expression type meaning conventional expression and individual expression. Well, if you think about it, if I expect you to use conventional expression, but I've defined conventional expression to be conformity to my expectations, well, then that's circular, so it just doesn't work. So clearly, the one that is not circular is going to be individual expression. So that's probably the one that people are going to expect if I'm going to reason about it like this. So therefore, the expectation is individual expression. So it follows from this that community meaning is built on individual meaning. Because if meaning is given by community practices, like I've presupposed just now, and the community practice is individual expression, well then, in order to conform to my community practice, you would need to individually express. So each individual's expression is a valid meaning, at least within that community. And because I've defined community meaning to be conformity to my expectations, a community meaning is built on individual meaning. Then it also follows that the separation of conventional and individual use is exaggerated, because it follows that conventional and individual use is not disjoint, because I've just defined conventional use to depend on individual use. So there's no strong reason really to hold the two in different regard, and it's in fact antithetic to condemn individual expression. Like earlier on I said, if you individually express, you'll never be able to be understood. Well, it's a bit wrong to say that in this case, because conventional expression depends on it. So, as mentioned, now we're going to think about the way we think about language and the way we think about syntax. So the strictly conventional view makes language contractual a little bit. Like I mentioned, it makes it sound like the speakers have a job to follow rules to meet expectations. And it makes it sound like the listeners have a job to evaluate the sentences according to the rules. So it sounds a bit weird, like I have a job to do, but it's language. And if you recall, this kind of thinking can lead to judgments about bad languages based on how well you can do the job. So if it's very hard to do the job and the language is about doing the job, then it makes it sound like the language is bad. And I argue even further that minimalist languages like toki pona are themselves an argument against this. Because if you recall the nature of minimalist languages and their implications, well, they are anti-realist for one, and they're arguing against this sort of notion based on the claims I've tried to justify it just now. So what are some implications for how we teach toki pona? I'll discuss that more later on. And the traditional view, as mentioned before, is reasonable for maximalist languages and popular, like English and French, etc. It makes sense to say those sort of things. And because they are reasonable for English, French, and German, for example, and the new learners are coming from those languages, so they might be expecting that this is also how it works in toki pona. But in fact, it's not, like I've tried to prove just now. So this might be a source of difficulty that the new learners face when they're trying to learn toki pona. So a little bit of a touchy topic now. So there's this concept of nimisin and nasin nasa, which effectively is about weird usages of languages and in fact novel usages of languages. So if I've explained that community meaning is built on individual meaning, it kind of seems like it opens up the objection to Locke again, because individual meaning is my personal belief that what I'm saying is appropriate for the situation, and I'm using it in a way that I judge to be appropriate. Well, you don't know about my judgment, so how can you communicate? But if you recall, the community's expectation is individual expression, and if you recall even further, individual expression is a personal judgment that an expression is suitable. So, like I've explained, that's sort of a belief that the expectation is to say what is personally reasonable for the circumstances. And if that sounds familiar, well, it is, because that's a stronger version of the principle of charity. It's stronger because principle of charity technically only requires that you're assuming that what a person says is reasonable for the circumstances, but I'm going further to say that the person believes that it is reasonable in the circumstances. That's a stronger requirement there. And so following expectations, which is the principle of charity, enables communication by radical interpretation, because if you follow the expectations, you are meaning something by your words, so I can radically interpret it. So if speaking toki pona entails conforming to toki pona expectations, then that justifies the assumption of our earlier claims about toki pona, which is that toki pona functions on radical interpretation and depends on the principle of charity. So I've mentioned more applications. So how does this affect teaching? Well, we often tell new learners to avoid nimisin and nasin nasa. Many justify this in relation to the rarity of use or idiosyncrasy. Like they say, if you use the nimisin that not many people use, like in nimi.ly, you see that only 5% of people use it, then I think you shouldn't use it, or something like that. Or if you use a certain way of phrasing, like if you phrase it in this specific way, people aren't going to understand you because that's not the way that the community does it. So that brings back my question, is this prescriptivism? Because it kind of sounds like a preference for what the community is doing. And if you remember, I've defined prescriptivism as holding a preference for a linguistic community's rules. And then after that, we go on to say that advanced speakers can experiment with it, which feels a bit of a double standard or a little bit vague. Like, what is the difference between advanced speakers and new learners that makes it such that they can experiment with it and that I can't? So aside from speakers who don't intend to be understood, like if they're making their own dialect or something and they're using it for themselves, aside from them, I am arguing that the difference actually is whether or not you are actually individually expressing. So new learners, when they use nimisin and nasin nasa, they are not actually individually expressing. And when advanced speakers use it, they are actually individually expressing. So the subversion of individual expression leads to poor comprehensibility, not necessarily just the rarity itself. Because, as I've explained, the expectation is that you individually express, and they are not individually expressing, so it's hard to understand them. So as mentioned, when they use nasin nasa and nimisin, they are actually either following outside conventions or they are thinking that toki pona requires convention. So for one example is that maybe they might be calquing grammatical forms, like the first example here. You might hear a new learner say mitawa wawa e ilomi, and they're trying to say I'm going to charge my device. But in English, when you are saying something that you are about to do, you slide in going to, and going to, in if you're trying to directly translate to toki pona, is tawa, because it means moving. So they think they need to add it there. And like I phrased it, they think they need to add it there. And it's not a personal expression, it's not an individual expression. They have added it because they think they need to, because of the grammar. Alternatively, another example is maybe they are basing the word use on definitions alone. Like if they say, I block you, I stop you from moving, I block you. Well, if you Google or if you search on nimi.ly, if you search the word block, this word pake comes out. It's actually a nimisin and people don't really use it much. So they say mi pake sina, not because they are using that word to personally express, but because they think they have to use it, because if you're trying to say the word block in that way, you must use that word. So again, it's not actually individual expression. In fact, it's the result of blindly following conventions. It's a pretty strong way of saying it, but that's what Wittgenstein says. They are blindly following the conventions, and it's not actually individual expression. On the other hand, when advanced speakers use them, they aren't blindly following, and they personally believe it to be appropriate. So for example, they might be using a nimisin because there's no other word they believe that is suitable to express what they're trying to express. And it's not because of conventions. So because it's still individual expression and it's a still personal belief of appropriateness, radical interpretation is still possible. So case study, this is really controversial, but I think it's really good to bring up. So there's this word called isipin, which comes from Tagalog, that was introduced by Ko in 2020. And in the time that it was introduced, both Ko and Soepipi Olipia have justified the use of isipin in slightly different ways, but the general gist is that they believe that it helps them express the difference between toki, sona, pilin, and isipin. So the idea is that sona is a bit too sure, like it's a knowledge, like it's a fact, like that's their argument, and that pilin is a bit too emotional. So they wanted something between that represents the uncertainty of pilin but without the emotionality. So they say that isipin allows them to express that specifically, and that's their individual expression, that's their personal belief, and you can actually see their personal belief reflected in use. So even if you don't know anything about isipin, you don't know the word and you've never used it yourself, well, you can tell from the way they use the word isipin the slight difference between the other words. So you can sort of carve out lines and you can radically interpret how they use it. So what are some pedagogical takeaways? We're still justified in cautioning new learners, but it's not because of conventional following. We should emphasize developing a sense of personal belief and expressions. So essentially the idea that you don't say things if you're not convinced that of why this is the right thing to say, if you're not convinced that this is directly expressing what you want to say. So like avoid using idioms, etc., because the idioms, you're using them conventionally that you're bringing over from other languages. So you're encouraging personal expression over conventional following, like I mentioned. And that can take time to develop, so caution is warranted. Like you shouldn't rush to try and do nimisin and nasinasa because you haven't really developed the sort of idea of personal belief in your expressions. You're still learning about the language, so it takes time to individually express, but it's not a hard and set rule. Like, notice that it's not a hard rule that you cannot do it, that you're not able to individually express, because then, well, that's prescriptivism. And that leads me on to the next point. We should take care to not be prescriptivist about toki pona. Like I've mentioned, it's not just the idea that our resources are not presenting themselves as definitive. Sometimes when you hold a preference for community following, it can still be prescriptivist in the end. So if you're talking to a new learner and you're personally feeling that such use is not justified, well, that's good for you, because personal feeling is how toki pona works. And if you're not agreeing with how people are using words, that's good. But notice that I'm talking about preference for common use over the individual expression. If you're holding your preference for common use, which might be how you personally feel, over other people's individual expressions, even if that's justified, even if it's warranted because you're worried that they might not actually be individually expressing, for example, if you're using your preference for common use as a justification for that over what might be their individual expression, well, that can be problematic. So there's a bit of nuance, is essentially what I'm trying to say here. So now I move on to the next section. I know that was a really long section, but we're moving on to more things now. So truth in toki pona. What is truth? Well, there's multiple theories of truth. There's a long historical debate since thousands of years ago, and modern discussions have sort of centered on a few kinds. Is truth a property? Is truth even something of its own right? Well, those are some questions that people have started asking these days. So the first theory of truth that I'll introduce is the correspondence theory of truth. Something is true if it corresponds to a fact, or more broadly, if it's a relation to reality, because fact might be inappropriate in some circumstances, so people have broadened it a bit. So fact, or whatever you're holding, is an element of reality. Or some people call it a truth giver. Or so for example, if snow is white in reality, like in reality snow is white, so then the sentence snow is white corresponds to the whiteness of the snow in reality, so it's true. Or like in my picture example, there's a notation I'm using there that's called first order logic, but it's essentially a proposition, so it might be a different thing because it depends on what you're saying is the thing that holds truth. So the first example, the sentence snow is white, I'm saying that sentences are holding truth. In the second example, which is a proposition, I'm saying that the proposition is holding the truth. Then next, there's the coherence theory of truth, which appeals to a nature of truth, which is the idea that if a system is consistent meaning there's no conflicts, there's no contradictions, if it's consistent as a whole, then it coheres and it's true. And it's true not because of anything else other than that being truth nature, like by nature, truth coheres. So if something coheres, it's true. And you can determine truth with standards of coherence. Like if you accept the system and it coheres and that's true, you can look at something else and you can determine whether it's true, whether it coheres with your system or not. Then there's pragmatism, is a pragmatist theory of truth, which is founded on inquiry and practice. It's quite a wide range of views. There's different views that people have split off over time, and they're actually quite they're quite vociferous in the way that they justify their different views. But overall, their rough idea is that you should be free to label things as true, and you label things as true based on whether it's useful or not, or some people argue based on whether it's a result of your inquiry, or based on whether it's practical, or whether holding that as true allows you to do things. And if it does, then that's the best you can do, and true is true. Then there's pluralism about truth, which is not strictly a theory of truth, but you can construe it to be one. It's just a view that there's different ways of being true, and it varies depending on the context. So like, for example, you might hold that mathematical truth is one way and moral truth is another way, and you can hold that the different ways of being true can both exist at the same time. It just depends on the context. So it argues against monism, which is that there's one way to be true. So if mathematical truth is this way, then moral truth must be that way. Then there's nihilism about truth, also called alethic nihilism, not to be confused with athletic, which is sports. This is alethic, which is about truth. So there's a few presentations here. Like, one of them is that there's no such thing as being true, and then there's another which is that nothing is true. Like, truth is some things you define that you accept that true can be attributed to something, except that there is nothing that fulfills that condition. There's nothing that truth can be attributed to. You accept that truth can be attributed to things, but you just say it's nothing. Then there's also definition of truth that lead to paradoxes. Like, for example, if you define truth in the other ways, there are things that come up like liar's paradox or Noah's paradox that are just seem to suggest that there can be no definition of truth that are consistent. So you might rationalize that since all definitions of truth lead to paradoxes, then there are no consistent definitions, and therefore there's no such thing as being true, for example. Then there's deflationism about truth, which is sort of the idea that there's no nature of truth to develop theories of, and that truth is merely expressive. It's just a way of phrasing things, and that all that can be said is of its linguistic purpose. So you're not saying that that the property of truth is really something more than just the fact that it allows you to express things. Like, for example, it allows you to say everything that Albert Einstein said is true, or it allows you to say that, let's say, Fermat's last theorem is true. So essentially, deflation is, some of them argue that the way I have used true there, it just allows me to affirm those sentences. Like, it allows me to affirm everything Albert Einstein said, but without listing everything that Albert Einstein said. Or it allows me to affirm that Fermat's last theorem is true, without just stating Fermat's last theorem, which is convenient because I've forgotten it. And it argues against inflationism, which is just the opposite idea, that there's a nature of truth, and that theories of truth, they're explanatory properties of truth. So like all the other ones before the last slide would sort of be inflationism. So there's some overlap of nihilism, as you can imagine, but it's not necessarily identical, although some people argue that it really should be. But just to not lock myself into accepting any one argument about it, I've listed them as different things here. So let's talk about realism again. So if there's realism about truth, then you're sort of talking about objective truth and stuff like that. So, but from here on out, I'll be assuming that sentences are the primary truth bearers just for convenience. Again, I'm not going to try and lock myself into any arguments because there's some arguments about this, like I mentioned, the other one is propositions. So there's an argument between the two. But for this presentation, I'll just say it's sentences and don't take anything from it. It's just convenience. But just a note, this is not necessarily truth conditional semantics. I'm not saying that sentences' meaning are just that their truth value. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that the primary thing that holds truth is a sentence. And other things that can hold truth, they're called secondary truth bearers, and their truth comes from the sentence's truth. Again, there's arguments about this, but I'll not go into it for now. So, like I mentioned in the introduction to this section, is there realism about truth? Objective truth? So, but that's a bit vague, like objective truth. So let's refine our definition a little bit. So when I say objective truth, I am saying two things. The first thing is that I say the world exists objectively. It exists outside of my conception and outside of my perception. So even if, let's say, I strongly believe that snow is red, if I believe in realism about truth, well, actually snow is still white, even though I believe it is red. And the second thing is that I hold that our claims are about that world that exists objectively. I hold that our claims, by assumption, our sentential claims are about that world. So by this definition, our claim should be objectively true or false, and supported by correspondence theories of truth. It's not necessarily correspondence, and vice versa, correspondence theories aren't necessarily realism, but there's some arguments that link the two, for example. And because it's supported because correspondence theories of truth, they provide these objective relations between in this assumption sentences and reality. So these relations, they can sort of support realism about truth because it gives you the substance that you need to determine the truth of sentences about the world. Equivalently, every sentence must either be true or false, and this is called bivalence, and this was introduced by Dummett. So let's focus on one particular aspect about truth, which is truth talk. Well, what is the purpose of truth talk? Truth talk is essentially just talks about truth. Like the example sentences I mentioned, everything Albert Einstein said is true. Well, it's truth talk because I've said is true there. So as mentioned, languages have expressions for truth, which is called alethic locutions, which is a bit of a fancy long word. Again, alethic means stuff to do with truth and truth values, and locutions refers to things that can be said. So expressions for truth, alethic locutions. Well, what do usages of these expressions actually say? Well, one question you might have, or one question that people do have, is, are expressions for truth genuine predicates? What is a genuine predicate? Well, if you look at the example on the right here, I have a totally unbiased sentence. Snow leopards are cool. Snow leopards are good. Well, in that sentence, when I say snow leopards are good, grammatically, you might be familiar with this. A sentence has a subject, here's snow leopards, and a predicate, which here is are good, which is actually just one way to analyze it, but it's convenient to talk about, so I'll use that to illustrate the points. So here, are good is a predicate, and it's asserting that snow leopards have this property called goodness, and it's a genuine predicate because it expresses an explanatory property, expresses a substantiative property, which is actually a thing that people differentiate substantive from in substantive, but actually for this presentation I won't go too deep into it. So are good is a genuine predicate by this definition. But can the same be said for is true? Like if I say the above is true, is true really asserting a property of truth for the above? If it is, then what is that property? Well, it's necessarily a genuine predicate in inflationist theories of truth. So the idea is that inflationist theories of truth, they are giving the property, they are giving the genuine property that is true is expressing here. And some argue that is true is actually not a predicate. Some argue that it's not a genuine predicate. Specifically, they argue it forms prose sentences, which is sort of like pronouns, except it's prose sentences. I've added illustration to talk more about that. So like for example, snow leopards are good, and then the above is true. Well, the above is actually referring to the sentence snow leopards are good, but it's referring to it as a noun, so it's called nominalization, which just means you make it a noun. So that's what the above means. And they argue that is true is called a prose sentence forming operator, which is basically just saying I put a normalization of a sentence next to the words is true, and it forms a prose sentence, and the prose sentence is equivalent to snow leopards are good because that's what is normalized by the above. It's sort of the same way that a pronoun pronominalizes a noun, like in here it's snow leopards, and then I have a sentence they are also fast, and they is a pronoun that refers to snow leopards, so it's equivalent to snow leopards are also fast. So it's the same thing, except that instead of a noun, it's an entire sentence. So they argue that aside from just forming prose sentences, it has no additional significance. So it's not a predicate, it's not asserting a property, it just forms prose sentences. So of note here, prosententialism is a kind of deflationism, but not all deflationists are prosententialists. So it's important to note that not all deflationists are saying it's not a predicate. Some do say it's a predicate, but they just say that it's not really expressing a property. So if you're holding like the intentionalist that is true is expressing a property, well then what is it? So if you compare the statements below, water is essential for life is true, and Sonia Lang is a conlanger is true. Well, if it expresses a property, you would expect that the property of truth has something in common. So what property do those sentences share? What property do the sentences water is essential for life and Sonia Lang is a conlanger share? Is it just that they share a property of truth? It feels a bit shallow to say that, because if you consider, when you say, like for example, things share a property of greenness, like if you say grass is green and you say leaves are green, you're saying more than just that they're all green. You're appealing to an underlying common nature between them. Specifically, you're appealing to the kind of light that gets reflected from them. You're saying that they are all within some range that you're calling green. So it's actually a genuine predicate here. But what is the underlying common nature of things that are true? So that's a separate debate that you can debate about. But now I'll be moving on to truth in toki pona. So what can be said about truth talk in toki pona? What would be the equivalent of truth talk in toki pona? Because we don't really have specific words that mean specific things, like I mentioned. There's no word that specifically just means truth. But we do have a word. We have a word lon. And it's very commonly associated with truth. In fact, in Nimi.li and in Linku, truth is one definition given for it. But it's arguably not really truth in the same way as natural languages. And for this reason, when I talk about truth now, for toki pona, I will be saying lon instead, because I want to honor that it's not necessarily the same. But well, what's the difference? And more importantly, how do people use lon? Taken as an alethic locution, lon is unique because for almost all speakers, lon is also a preposition. And here when I'm talking about how common an expression is, I'm not trying to be prescriptivist, I'm just doing it descriptively. So when they use lon, they also express a very wide range of concepts. As I mentioned, there's no fixed one definition, so people use lon to express a bunch of things other than just true or false. So how do these differences affect its function in lon talk? So the first thing, prepositional usage. For many, lon is also a preposition of location. So something like at, on, or etc. So x lon y affirms x location in relation to y. So as such, many also use lon to talk about existence and reality. So this can be argued that it leads to an underlying common nature, because if you're using lon to talk about reality and you're saying that x lon y means x is at or on, etc., just some location relative to y, then you can say that something is lon if it refers to something somewhere in reality. So if you can say that x lon y for some x, then x is lon. And that's actually a correspondence theory of lon, because you're establishing some relation between truth-bearers sentences here and reality, because you're establishing that it must refer to something somewhere in reality. And it's represented by the schema here. I originally sent a poll with some of these schemata, but there was a slight oversight in that poll, so I'm not going to be including the results directly here, at least not for the schemata. And this suggests that x lon is a generic predicate that expresses a property. Well, the property is that it refers to something somewhere in reality. So like, for example, if someone says grass is green, well, that's lon because it refers to the green grass that is lon the ground. As an aside, it's worth investigating if this interpretation of lon is realist. So if you accept that lon expresses the property as described earlier, it may be possible that x lon y, where y is an element of conception, like for example, x lon pilin mi, which is like my perception literally, or x lon sonami, which is like x is in my knowledge. And it's not actually a realist world. It's not the world that exists objectively, because it's literally my perception and my conception. So it goes against at least one of the two statements. It goes against at least the objectivity part, or maybe it goes against the part where I say it's a claim about the world, because it's not about the world, it's about me. So it's not trivial to argue that it is realist. However, lon is often used for simple agreement as well. Like if you've ever heard in chat, when someone is saying something and people agree with it, they might say lon, or they might say ni lona, or they might send the lon emote. But they don't really mean that what that person said refers to somewhere in reality. They're just using it to refer to simple agreement that they think it's cool, they agree with it. So in fact, our correspondence theory might be saying a bit too much. So there's some possible responses you might have for this. You might say that it's explained by pragmatism, which is basically saying that when you say something is lon, it's a judgment of usefulness or sufficiency. So that's the genuine property there. So you label statements as lon accordingly, based on whether you judge that it's useful or sufficient. But as a counterpoint to that, some people use lon as a discourse marker, or for back channeling. If you don't know what that is, basically they don't mean anything by it at all. They just say it so that you know that they are there, or they just say lon because they want you to know that they have read your message and they would like you to continue talking. Or like if you're familiar with Japanese, you might know that people go so, and that's a form of back channeling to let you know that they are listening to what you have said. So it's saying a bit too much for that. So you might say instead it's explained by deflationism. So lon is not actually a genuine property. It is the speaker is just affirming the statement through the reference. So like if I say needy lon, I'm affirming the statement through the ni part. So the ni is referring to your sentence, and I'm affirming the statement through the pronoun, through the demonstrative there. And I'm saying that's just how lon functions. That's not the nature of lonness. Lon is just there so that I can refer to statements through references. And so if you explain it this way, it fulfills the usage as a discourse marker of a back channeling, because you're just affirming a statement, you're not really saying anything by it. It's also possible to argue that lonness varies with context between speakers. And this is sort of a pluralism about lon. And it's in line with toki pona's nature, because toki pona is all about, it's by nature anti-realist, so it's all about people having their own subjective views and stuff. And it's also represented by the fact that in my poll, when I sent the poll about how people felt about different ways of using lon, well, people often objected to those statements because they said that they felt that it was not globally applicable. So, like I mentioned, it's not guaranteed that lon is actually the same thing as the truth that we're familiar with, because there's some issues with that. So there are certain interpretations that can be philosophically challenging to justify its truth. Like, for example, can a statement be lon while its content is not? Like you might say, if someone says something, the thing that they have said, not the content, the very sentence utterance that they have said is lon, because it's lon discord, or it's a lon via mind, so it's lon. But the content, you might argue that it's not actually lon. So if you accept that, then it's a bit philosophically challenging, because that's one of the things that people say, well, not everyone, but some people say that it's a criterion for adequacy for theories of truth. So if it doesn't even hold that, then is that really the truth that we're familiar with? And in other cases, even if you don't talk about that, it's just challenging to interpret, because like I mentioned, it's necessarily a very varied word. So it's very hard to interpret it specifically and precisely to refer to our natural languages, the way that they use true. So you might think, are there other toki pona expressions of truth? Like, what about pakalaala, which is sort of like it's a opposite expression. It's kind of like an expression of falsehood. So you might negate it and then it's truth. So you're free to explore that a bit. I'm not going to go so deep into that here. So then we move on to our fourth section, which is knowledge in toki pona. Well, for one, what is knowledge? Like, not taking it for granted. How does knowledge affect how people understand? And how does knowledge affect how people talk? And what is knowledge's role in the process of communication? Well, traditionally, knowledge is taken to be three things. First is factive. Knowledge is taken to be of something true. Then is belief. I can't know something I don't believe in. And belief here is defined as the attitude of taking something to be true. And lastly, knowledge must be justified. So I must have grounds to believe that something is true. I can't just guess that it's true and then say that my guess is knowledge. I need to have actual rational definitions for this. So by this definition, it's possible to have justified belief in falsehood. And it's important to note that by this definition also, justified belief in falsehood is not knowledge. For example, if I have a friend that has reliably told me truth, and they lie to me, like they say, I got 100 on my exam and they didn't actually get 100, but because they're so reliable, I believe them, and justifiably because they've never lied to me before. Well, it's still a falsehood, So by this definition, it's not knowledge. Then we move on to a very specific part of epistemology and language, which is this concept called presuppositions. So if you hold this definition, when you say A knows that B, it actually presupposes B. And presupposes here, I'm talking about knows, marking that B is being taken for granted. Because of the fact that if you know something, then it can't be true. So when you say A knows that B, then, well, B has to be true, doesn't it? So this idea that what I've said marks B as being taken for granted, even though I'm not saying that B is true, it's called a presupposition trigger. So specifically effective presupposition trigger. And here it's on knows, because it's what's making the presupposition happen. So like, for example, if I say, I know you hate leaks, well, that presupposes that you hate leaks, even though I didn't really say just you hate leaks. But what is taken for granted specifically? Well, StyleMaker here offers specifically that P presupposes Q if P would otherwise be inappropriate, so like you might not understand it, or it might feel a bit of a weird thing to say, if not for Q. And if Q was not already presupposed. There's actually many kinds of presupposition triggers, and there's a bunch of research into that. For example, he stopped running presupposes that he was running before that. I know everyone there presupposes that there are people there. And my cat meow presupposes that I have a cat. And specifically the triggers here are stop, everyone, and my. But not all presuppositions come from presupposition triggers. Some are pragmatic presuppositions. So they don't come from a specific word or phrasing. They come just from me saying it, or just the nature of things. Like for example, this presentation presupposes that you speak English, because if you didn't speak English, I have just wasted 2 hours. But well, what happens when a presupposition is false, which is also called presupposition failure, at least by this definition? So like for example, if I say, I know everyone on Mars, but that kind of presupposes that there are people on Mars. What does that mean? Or if I say the king of Antarctica is old, well, that presupposes that Antarctica has a king. And that often renders statements nonsensical. But the question you might have is, does it always? So I have a paper for you to see if you're interested in that. And are these statements always false? For example, if you consider I know the king of Antarctica and I do not know the king of Antarctica. If presupposition failure makes statements false, then both statements are false, which is a bit of a weird thing, because if you think about it, that means that you're saying both something and its negation are both false. And if you are the kind of person that argues that something must be either true or false, and that it and its negation cannot both be the same truth value, then that's a bit of a weird thing for you. Some people are okay with that, but some systems of logic and some systems of deduction say that that's not okay. And it's usually more natural to say that it's not okay. So the question is it okay? It's a bit of a weird thing. And a similar question can arise for pragmatic presupposition. Like for example, Soeli Suli Alu is kind, but Haru is not. Which is a weird thing because that presupposes that Soeli Suli Alu is not the same person as Haru, but that is me, and those are both my names. So it is both the same individual. So Frege and Strawson, they propose that they have no truth value instead. So they're neither true nor false, because that avoids some of the problems there. But Strawson later revised his claim. So he says later on that the former is false, that I know the king of Antarctica is false, but its negation is true. And he says it's natural not to say this, because the sentence, I know the king of Antarctica, is not really about who knows the king of Antarctica. In fact, it's about who I know. I'm saying that I know the king of Antarctica. So because of the fact that the king of Antarctica is not the topic of discourse, which is also said as it's not at issue, so it's kind of okay to say that's just false, because the king of Antarctica, no matter who he is, even if he doesn't exist, well, it's clear that I don't know him, so it's clearly false, at least to him. And he says that it only results in no truth value if the topic of discourse is affected. So if I say instead that the king of Antarctica is young, then now there's no truth value, because the topic of the discourse is who is young. So who is the king of Antarctica is now relevant. And because there's no king of Antarctica, there's just no truth value for this, at least to him. So if you compare instead, the king of Antarctica is known by me, which is sort of the same thing as saying I know the king of Antarctica, but now I phrased it with the passive voice. And in English, when you phrase things with the passive voice, very often it actually emphasizes the promoted object. So it emphasizes here the king of Antarctica. And because it's emphasized it, people might perceive that to be the topic now. People might perceive it to be about whether, about who is known, about who the king of Antarctica is known by. So that can be the perceived topicality there. And because that's the perceived at issue thing, and the king of Antarctica does not exist, then there's no truth value. But consider this. If I say now, the king of Antarctica is sitting in that chair, well, Strawson's revised view would suggest that this has no truth value, because the topic is still the king of Antarctica, and he doesn't exist. But what if I'm now pointing in an empty chair, and I say the king of Antarctica is sitting in that chair, that empty chair right there? Strawson's revised view would still say it has no truth value, but Leserson argues that it is natural to say it's false. That if I point at an empty chair and I say the king of Antarctica is sitting on that chair, I can say it's false. Because you can see that when I point to that chair, there's no one on that chair. So it provides perceptual justification. So you can have knowledge that there is no one in that chair. And if you know that there's no one in that chair, and I say there's someone on that chair, regardless of who that person is, you can say it's false. So it doesn't actually matter who the king of Antarctica is, it's just false. So he attributes this to the pragmatics of verification. So he says that knowledge allows people to verify a statement despite presupposition failure. If it's unverifiable without addressing the presupposition, then Leserson agrees there's no truth value. Like if I say, if I say the king of Antarctica is sitting on that chair, but I'm not pointing to any chair and you don't know which chair it's on, then in that case, he might agree there's no truth value. Now consider this. A tells B, C's dog is brown. But A doesn't know that B actually doesn't know that C has a dog, but A says that anyway. This statement presupposes that C has a dog, because C's dog is a trigger for that presupposition. The presupposition is true. C actually has a dog. But the statement likely confuses B anyway, because B does not know that C has a dog. So when B hears this, it's a bit confusing, because to them, C has no dog. So it motivates a broadening of our definition for presupposition failure. When presupposition P does not belong to the common ground, and common ground is basically that all accept P and believe that all accept P, and they believe that all accept P, and etc, etc, etc. So that's the common ground. When the presupposition P does not belong to the common ground, then that's presupposition failure. Sorry, it's a bit of a tongue twister to say presupposition that many times. But what about toki pona? Well, toki pona heavily involves presupposition. Like if you recall, toki pona relies on the principle of charity. So it relies heavily on context. How does toki pona deal with presupposition failure? Well, I claim it follows that the principle of charity is a pragmatic presupposition. It follows from it being an assumption of the language. So, similar to how this presentation presupposes you speak English, if I say something in toki pona, I'm also presupposing that you are saying something. If you recall, the lack of intention of relevance is incoherent in toki pona. So the failure of this presupposition just results in inappropriate utterances. Like if I say some random thing in toki pona, it's likely that you're not going to be able to understand it, or it's going to be really weird to you. So I claim that toki pona heavily involves presupposition. Like if you recall, personal expression is necessary in toki pona. It would otherwise be inappropriate if not for my personal belief. So that's, if you recall, our broadened definition of presupposition. So then that implies that it's a presupposition, that I presuppose my personal beliefs when I personally express, if the personal beliefs are not already presupposed. But is this bad? I claim that toki pona requires presupposition accommodation. In personally expressing, I don't assume you have my belief. But if I don't assume you have my belief, that appears to contradict our broader definition. However, listeners can adjust their common ground to include my belief. If you recall, my belief can be radically interpreted. So like if I say a sentence in toki pona, and the way I've used the word is not something that the person I'm talking to believes in. Like if I say, for example, mi soweli e moku, it's a bit weird to some people because they might not be familiar with how I'm using the word soweli as a verb there. However, if you think about it, the way I've used it, it's just that soweli is a verb there. And you can imagine that if soweli refers to like kind of animals, land beasts, you can imagine that maybe I'm saying I have shaped the food into the shape of a soweli. Even if you didn't believe before that that is a way you can use soweli, you can believe it now that that is a way you can use soweli. You can include that into your common ground. And after you include that into your common ground, which is what is called presupposition accommodation, after you accommodate it, then it doesn't contradict the broader definition anymore. Because even though I don't assume you have my belief, you end up having my belief anyway. But it's important to note, when I say that you have my belief, it's not saying that you must have my belief forever. It's just for the purposes of this conversation, so that you understand me. When I continue say mi soweli is other stuff, you understand what I mean by what I say when I say mi soweli e. Like, you don't actually have to agree with that usage, but you will just understand what I'm saying. But what if this fails? What if my belief is too controversial? What if the radical interpretation is too unrefined? Like, what if just the one time I say mi soweli e moku, that's not enough for a person to understand what I mean by mi soweli e something? Then there's this thing called presupposition failure, and when that happens, then you enter into presupposition repair. And presupposition repair is a kind of conversation repair. So for example, the example I gave, mi soweli e moku, presupposes that you can soweli e moku. someone could feel that this is too controversial, that you can't soeli emoku, and then they might ask, "Sina seme emoku?" Like, what are you doing to the moku? Because I don't understand what you mean by soeli emoku, because I don't believe you can soeli emoku, for example. Is that bad? Is it bad that you have to repair if this fails? Well, Glenn Spitz suggests that this is normal even for natural languages, that based on what triggers you have, there's mandatory optional repair. Sorry if I randomly pause, I've been sipping water because this talk is pretty long. But that brings me to the conclusion. Hopefully through this talk, you were able to see some applications of philosophy to language and toki pona. Like applications to teaching, to being able to understand the principles of toki pona, and the way that people have advised learners. They like to repeat a lot of things. I have found that when they repeat things, they kind of repeat it just on the basis that it's been working. So hopefully through this talk, you can see the philosophical justification and reasoning for those advice. And of course, thank you for listening to my talk. I know it's been a very long 2 hours plus, but I do have a forum post in Tomomute titled Lonely Lon, which is the title of this talk. I encourage you to discuss and ask questions there if you have any, because the purpose of this talk is to get people to start talking about things, and I hope you do it in Toki Pona, but if you can't, English is fine too. Hope to see you there. Some final notes, credits, because I'm a nice person. This has been inspired by Michael Morse's An Introduction to the Philosophy of Language, Coins One in Object, David G. Stern's The Cambridge Companion to Wittgenstein, the Oxford Handbook of Truth, edited by Michael Glansberg, which I've quoted before, and some sections from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Truth. If you're interested in what I've read, the first book is actually pretty good to read, so I recommend it. And if you're wondering how I made these slides, I made them using types, using the Diet Types template. And a lot of references. If you're interested in any of them, I suggest you check them out and read about stuff. And thank you so much for listening to me yap for very long.